If you've been listening to the Historians of the Movies podcast for a little while, maybe you've picked up on a recurring trend, which is talking about the European American invasion of indigenous lands. And maybe you've picked up on this as some of the more explicit episodes we've done, things like Far and Away or even Jeremiah Johnson. Or maybe implicitly when we've talked about films like Last of the Mohicans or Dances with Wolves or other films that kind of talk about these events and relationships between peoples as they confront one another and how they react. And I wanted to do that again today, maybe with a film that you've probably never seen. It's called Black Robe. It comes out in 1991 amongst a slew of other films, things like Dances with Wolves, Last of the Mohicans, Far and Away, as we just mentioned. And it follows a Jesuit missionary as he's trying to found a mission in New France. And he's trying to do so with the help of a group of Algonquins. And it talks about his relationships with them, his experiences, questioning of his own faith, if you will, as he goes into the movie. It's made in Canada, this film. You see the relationships he has with Algonquins, with Hurons towards the end of the film, and also how Algonquins and Hurons are relating to one another, how they are relating to these Europeans who are coming into their indigenous and sovereign lands. And it's not something we see often on film. So I was really excited to get to do this. I actually first got introduced to this film by my professor at Wichita State University. His name's Robert Owens, and he kind of set me off onto a path of wanting to learn more about Native North America. And this film proved integral to doing so. So I think maybe if you haven't had a chance to see this film, you really should. It can be a tough watch. It's not an easy watch to watch, but I wanted to because I wanted to talk today to Michael Leroy Oberg. Now, if you know anything about Michael Oberg, you know he's also a scholar of Native North America. He's published so many books: Dominion and Civility, English Imperialism in Native America, Uncas, First of the Mohegans, Samuel Wiseman's Book of Record, the official account of Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, The Head in Edward Nugent's Hand, Roanoke's Forgotten Indians. He's published all over the place. But he's probably best known as the author of Native America, which is a textbook that you can use when you are teaching Native North American history. And it's absolutely fantastic. I've read through it. I've used it to teach when I was teaching as well. And I wanted to talk to Mike today, not only about Black Robe, but also the process maybe behind creating textbooks, say, versus creating your traditional histories. So, and Mike was just gracious enough to sit down and talk to me. It was the last pod we recorded before we moved to Colorado. It was the first pod we recorded once we got Buster. So you may hear him running around the background. But this is maybe a little bit more cerebral of a podcast that you'll hear today, and I hope you dig it. So if you haven't seen Black Robe, absolutely sit down, check this film out. If you haven't, this is still an awesome opportunity to kind of go back and revisit 17th century New France, maybe understand that landscape a little bit better. I hope you dig this podcast. So if you will, sit back and relax, because Black Robe is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Michael Oberg, how are you, man?
I'm great. It's nice to be here. It's nice to talk to you after all these years of being in touch on Twitter and Facebook and things like that.
I know it's been crazy. I started following you years ago, and I forget how. I think it was Twitter, maybe. I think I talk to you more on Facebook now these days than I do on the other social media platforms.
Well, I haven't left Twitter like I guess a lot of people have, just because I'm too lazy to try to get anything else going. And I've played around with Mastodon and Threads, but I just don't. I got limited time for it. So Twitter and Facebook are about it for me, I think.
We were talking about trying to figure out a movie, and we ended up choosing this 1991 film, Black Robe, to talk about. Before we jump into that, maybe we can introduce the audience to yourself and what you do.
Yeah, well, I'm a historian. I teach at State University of New York College at Geneseo, SUNY Geneseo, which is about 30 miles south of Rochester, New York, where I live. I've been at Geneseo since 1998, except for 1 year when I took a job at University of Houston. For all all the reasons one's supposed to take one of these jobs at a bigger university. And we lasted in Houston as a family for a year. Houston, it's in Texas, and it just wasn't our place. It wasn't good. The department was great. It was nice people. But we came back here to Western New York. I teach classes I teach a Native American survey class. I teach classes occasionally on the history of the Haudenosaunee, colonial America, American Revolution. We used to have a course called Western Humanities, which was a great books course. I love teaching it. I started teaching it largely because I hadn't really read a lot of these great Western books, and I needed to read them and just started chatting with students. So it's a small public, underfunded liberal arts college where the nature of the teaching involves you kind of getting out of your area of specialty, which as I've gone on in this job for a while, I kind of like that approach to teaching. I've been in Geneseo, so this is my 25th year in Geneseo. I taught for 4 years in Montana. Before that at MSU Billings, which was a small kind of satellite campus in this Montana state system. Montana's gorgeous. I was in such a dysfunctional department, though, that in a way I feel really fortunate, Jason, because the things people complain about at my current institution, and I've been there 25 years, I've got plenty of grievances, the things that grieve about, things people complain about, I'm like, who cares, man? It's not the department I was in. So it gave me this cushion of just being, blissful about a lot of things, and so I like it there a lot. Geneseo is a Seneca place name. Mm-hmm. And you can make the case that Geneseo is a Seneca town. It was one of the biggest towns in New York in the 17th century and even into the 18th century. A lot of what I'm doing now is trying to kind of reach out and educate the public, sort of making the point that New York State couldn't have taken its current shape without a systematic program of indigenous dispossession that at times, mm-hmm. just in black and white, violated the laws of the United States. And Geneseo is central to that story. There's no college in the SUNY system that's more closely connected to that history of dispossession than our school, for all kinds of reasons. We'll get us off the topic here. But that awareness and that growing awareness has really made me attracted to programs like yours, where you're getting out in various ways to try to reach outside of the academy to hit history where people are.
Very similarly here in Florida, right? I spent 3 years serving the Seminole Tribe of Florida, working for them, writing an ethnographic study of the Everglades. And, before that, I was obviously writing my dissertation about Seminoles and Miccosukes, and talking to folks who are tribal members of those respective tribes about their own families and histories and stuff like that. And of course, you talk to non-tribal members as well. And the thing that always blows my mind down here in Florida is how many people I run into don't know that there are still tribes, indigenous people here in the state. And, you talk about like this mass removal, and mass movement of dispossession. Yeah. And yet everything, when you drive around, there are so many place names written all over the state of Florida, like there are in New York, like there are in Iowa. There's an I see Osceola County, Iowa. It's almost bewildering. And that's part of the reason I'm so passionate about this, and wanted to really start this movie, obviously very, very, and there's Buster the dog, focuses in on, the early processes of this, right? Where we talk about smallpox and the erasure of folks and so forth. So I was really excited to have you on. One of the things I want to talk to you about, though, is you're the first person we've spoken to who's actually written a textbook on subject matter. And I was kind of wondered, like, how does that work? How do you create a text?
That's a great question. And I in some ways, I feel like I don't know the answer to that. I stumbled across it. I was at a conference, and this acquisitions editor said, "Hey, have you ever thought of doing that?" And I had lecture notes. And back then I tended to lecture in my classes. I don't do that anymore. And the lecture notes for the course, it's a one semester survey of Native American history, that really provided the outline. And, I just started reading everything that struck me as really valuable since I'd been in graduate school, to kind of catch up with the entire chronological scope of the field. And it's in its third edition now. I've got a former Geneseo alum who recently got his PhD at William & Mary, Peter Olson Harvick, is co-writing it now, and he'll co-write the subsequent volumes or subsequent editions if they are. And every 3 months on my blog, I put up a post of like what you should be reading, right? And
I love that.
That's I'm not doing a service there. I'm doing my own work there. This is my reading list for when I do the next edition, and I find it's really great. I enjoy that part of it because it keeps me up with the field much more broad. I mean, my dissertation was on the period from 1585 to 1685. I was really trained as a colonial historian, and it really allowed me to broaden my understanding of Native American history. The thing is, I felt like, writing, I've written a couple of monographs as well, and I felt that those were at times really work. There's times where it's really slogging up a hill and it's hard. The textbook, when I did the first edition, I got pretty depressed at one point writing it because nothing seems to get better. And this was sort of, reflection of the time. But what I find it more enjoyable because there is, and there's so much good work being produced outside of the colonial era in Native American history that was a world of scholarship I really wasn't tuned into at all. And just by keeping up with the field, I get to learn a lot. I get to see some really fantastic stuff. That work has insights and perspectives that can improve and inform my own work. And now that I'm writing a big book, a big monograph, I'm writing a history of the Onondaga Nation, and that covers from Sky Woman's fall to something close to the present, and that textbook work has helped a lot in sort of navigating the literature. So I find it kind of an enjoyable way to keep up with the literature. I don't make a ton of money out of it, which is sort of disappointing, but it gets out there, and it's not. I don't find it nearly as difficult as writing a monograph.
I don't know how you do it. And I've got a copy of your text, and to be able to put all of that history, it seems like such a Herculean task. I mean, look, writing a monograph sounds Herculean, but hold on. I'm gonna have to learn how to do this pod with these dogs. This is going to be for people who are listening right now. It's like, not only am I a scholar and a podcaster, now I'm the father of like 2 kids, and I'm sitting here, I'm talking to you. I'm also like, please God, boys, take the dog out, please, so I can just do this. This is fun. It is, it's a thing that like I look at it and go, how do you contextualize this? And you talking about like being depressed during this. I have nowhere near that experience, but God, writing my own dissertation was a process of just sheer punch through, just get through this thing. And not a lot of fun at times when I was doing this.
No.
At the same time, maybe it's just because of the subject matter and things like that, because it's very easy, I think, sometimes to get bogged down in the negative and things like that. But some of these stories are absolutely amazing when you talk about the resilience of folks who encounter genocide, who have to continually, and I talk to folks today, have to continually hear that they're not here in Florida when in fact, so in the case of Seminole Tribe of Florida, very vibrant community.
Right.
It's a frustrating thing. But I wanted to talk to you about this movie today, this movie Black Robe, which comes out in 91. Tells maybe a different story than I think maybe a lot of Americans. This is probably not a film that a lot of our listeners have seen before. It's not a huge film in the United States. Kind of comes out post Dances with Wolves and amongst these other movies that are coming out that kind of maybe do we qualify this as a Western film? It's got some dynamics there. Wanted to jump in on this and talk about what this movie is, what it does, and like how maybe you can like kind of look at this film. So film takes place in 17th century, Great Lakes region. We're talking Algonquian country. We've got a Jesuit missionary who's going into Algonquian country. He's on his way to the Hurons. I guess maybe we can kind of set the stage and talk a little bit about jumping in the 17th century. Who are the Algonquians? Like, where are these folks living? Like, what's going on here?
Well, there's Algonquian. This always confuses my students. Algonquian is like Iroquoian. It's a language family, right? And there's Algonquian people all over the place. The Powhatans in Virginia were Algonquins. The Pequots, Mohegans, they're Algonquians. But you got a group that was identified by the French as Algonquins who lived in that borderland region between what is today Montreal and Quebec and New York State, and they're sort of closest into the French. In the movie, the Black Robe, Father Laforgue is going to be escorted from Quebec. This is in 1634, very early in the history of New France, upriver, escorted by the Algonquins through Mohawk country, the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, on the way to the Huron mission, which is up by Georgian Bay and sort of north, well to the north and west of Lake Ontario. It's an enormous undertaking. One of the things that strikes me really interesting about it is, and one of the questions I throw out to students when I've had them use it. I never show movies in class, but I'll say, go look at this, movie. Unfortunately, it's on Amazon right now, so you can see it. But is, what kind of imperialism is this? If you've got essentially one dude paddling with a group of Algonquins, clearly into foreign territory where he is the outsider, to go minister to this community that, by all measures was a powerful group, right? The Huron is a word that it's an old French term meaning, ruffian or rustic, right? And so we refer to them as Wendots now, and they're very much a confederacy, a lot like the more familiar Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, right? And the Wendat Confederacy consisted of 4 or 5 nations. They may have had as many as 40,000 people at their peak, a score of villages spread amongst these 4 nations. And they were settled in the sense that they were a Three Sisters people, corn, beans, and squash, with a little bit of protein added to that through hunting. And they had these settled towns. Jesuits had tried to minister to groups like the Innu. They're referred to by an older name. It was often used in Montaigne in the film. They tried to minister to groups like the Algonquins, and those groups were moving so often it was very hard for the French to set up shop and set up a mission. The more stationary Wendat and later on the Haudenosaunee, they seemed like a riper target for that kind of work. So Father Laforgue he's going into the heart of Wendake, right, the Wendat homeland, to spread what in his view is the one and only true religion, to save the souls of the Wendat people. And look, this movie was based on a relatively short novel by a guy named Brian Moore, who I believe wrote the screenplay for the movie. His book is really, and the movie itself, and in fact the way it's sort of edited, you can kind of see this. It's sort of this. He's clipping vignettes out of this volume, this series of books known as the Jesuit Relations. And I think there were about 73 volumes of the Jesuit Relations, if I guess right. And I have by no means read all of them, but I've read the volumes dealing with the Onondagas, which is the center of the Haudenosaunee. They live near today's Syracuse, quite often and quite closely. And I use, edited versions like Alan Greer's edited collection of the Jesuit Relations in my research methods classes. So I'm pretty familiar with these texts. And I think one of the things with this movie you got to keep in mind is that the Jesuit Relations, this was Christian Catholic propaganda. This was the Jesuits writing these annual reports for those interested back home in France to follow the advance of the kingdom of Christ in the New World. These are books about what the Jesuits were doing. And the movie has those limitations, right? This movie's Black Robe. It's about a Jesuit guy. And the Indians are all sort of things he bounces off of and interacts with on his journey. And we're led to believe he's changed by it at the end. But the ending is sort of a downer in a way, as is the history. The Jesuits themselves, and a lot of this is in the movie, and that's one of the things I think is really strong about the movie, is the Jesuits emphasize language. And they recognize that you can't do what the conquistadors did to convert the indigenous peoples of New France, right? First of all, they don't have the numbers to do that. They don't have the strength to do that. There's not going to be a military conquest. So the only way to convert people is to talk with them and to do your best to explain things to them. And that in and of itself was difficult, right? To try to explain that the concept of the Trinity Is it 1 or is it 3? And that was difficult to do given grammar. And the Jesuits write about all this stuff, but they learn the language, and they often stayed in place for a while. That despite their biases, which are considerable, and despite their commitment to transforming Indigenous people, and despite their belief that there's really nothing of value in these cultures as they are at present, nonetheless, they are perhaps the richest ethnographic source that survives from the 17th century. I think many people who watch this film are as undergraduates are reading the Jesuit Relations, right? We're sort of watching this relationship as the Jesuits understood it, trying to deduce meaning that the Jesuits may have misinterpreted, right? And the cool thing about the movie is that often we have these encounters, and then you have a couple of the Indigenous people speaking off to the side amongst themselves, sort of analyzing what they've just seen. And the best example is this great scene, and I've used this scene just in class, where this is something that shows up in the Jesuit Relations a lot, is that Indigenous peoples in the Northeast were fascinated by reading and writing.
Yeah.
And in the movie, this scene is where Father Laforgue is writing in his journal or something like that. And Chomina, who's the leader of this Algonquin band, asks him what he's up to. And he explains reading to Chomina by asking Chomina, tell me something I don't know. And, he writes it down. Then he takes it over, without saying a word, takes it over to Daniel, who's sort of the counter to Father Laforgue, a French person who's attracted in all sorts of ways to Indigenous culture and Indigenous lives. And he reads it back. And so these words have traveled through space with no action by Laforgue.
Black Robe, what you do?
Making words.
Words? You not speak.
I will show you. Tell me something.
Tell what?
Something I do not know.
My woman's mother died in snow last winter.
Wow, your mama Chidu.
Wabima, Machi, Ashton.
Hey, Ashton, you have him out, Black Robe.
Last winter, Chomina's wife's mother died in the snow.
And at the end of this, after Laforgue says something like, "There's many other things I can show you," you have these couple of the Indigenous people outside saying, "Well, he's a demon," and that's such an interesting scene, because generally these cultures, a lot of this part of the region, a lot of the spiritual life is directed not towards worshiping a good, great God, but it's directed towards deflecting the wrath of a mischievous or malevolent figure. And so it was very easy for Jesuits to watch that and say, "Oh, they're worshiping the devil." And no, they're not. They're not doing that at all. But that was, I think it's easy to see how the Jesuits get there. And throughout that film, and I like this like part, I'm telling you all the parts I like about the movie. You see Indigenous people sort of marveling at the strangeness of the Jesuits, and that sense is there. All these things about the Jesuits seemed odd. Their total lack of interest in having sex with women, having any kind of sexual contact. Their ability not to get sick. They weren't as susceptible to these diseases, to these virgin soil epidemics as were Indigenous people. Technology they carried with them, right? The clock scene early in the movie, right? It's one of the first scenes in the movie, and then writing, right? And all kinds of technology that led Indigenous people quite reasonably to conclude that these interlopers had the power to do things that ordinary people couldn't do. The Indigenous person in that one reading scene says, "Well, they're demonic," and he's you hear it, Manitou. They have Manitou, right? The power to do things that ordinary humans can't, and that's what you're wrestling with. So the movie, along with nice selections of the Jesuit relations that you might use in a class or whatever, it gives you a good way to talk about what Indigenous people are seeing, how they're understanding it, apart from how the Jesuits characterize that understanding, which is often simplistic and highly judgmental.
So one of the things I find fascinating in this film, because my interests lie not only in, say, Indigenous history, but also obviously very much environmental history, was, we talk about the different types of colonialism, different types of conquest. Certainly the religious aspect here is what we're focusing on here, or at least what the film focuses on, focusing on the relationships of this missionary and as he moves his way throughout Indigenous country. But then there's also very much the remnant of like this economic transformation as well that has affected the environment, talking about specifically here the beaver wars. And I'm kind of, maybe if you could kind of, this is one of my favorite things to kind of talk about, but since you're here, I thought maybe you might kind of talk about what these beaver wars are and kind of how they transform Native North America in the Northeast Great Lakes region as well.
Yeah, there's a great article. It doesn't have to do with this region, but by a historian or an anthropologist named Bruce White. It appeared in Ethnohistory, I think back in the 80s or 90s. And he quotes some Ojibwe traders, indigenous traders, talking about how the beaver makes things for us, right? It makes pots, pans, flints, guns, knives, and stuff like that. And the Jesuits sort of scoff at that, like the beaver doesn't do anything. It's just a big rodent, that,
Right.
But they felt that, look, this is an animal, and animals have spirits, and the hunt can't be conducted successfully without the assistance of the powers one gains through ritual. The beavers don't allow themselves to be taken if they're not treated with the appropriate decorum, and therefore, so the beaver allow you to transform them into these material objects of use, and you see that at sort of at the outset, where essentially the fur trade, but gift giving in general, right? Where Champlain gives knives and colored beads and things like that to Chomina's band as sort of a gift for escorting Father Laforgue to the Wendat mission. The 17th century was an era of extraordinary warfare in the history of the Northeast. It was constant. The Haudenosaunee, the whole League of the Iroquois, is a response to this constant warfare. And I think in a sense it intensifies very quickly after 1634. The Jesuits are sort of walking into and causing at the same time this maelstrom of destruction. 1634 was the great smallpox epidemic began to hit the Wendat. Mm-hmm. I talk about it in my book on Uncas. It began in southern New England and it worked its way up there. And lots of people died, obviously. And you see some of that hinted at in the movie. When a community suffered a loss, there was grief. And one way of dealing with grief was to, if other things hadn't worked, was to adopt an outsider to embody or take the place of the person who had died. And this is Daniel Richter's Mourning War thesis, right? Mm-hmm. And the way Richter describes it, there's a historiography. You could start a fight in an empty bar over the Wars of the Iroquois, the so-called Wars of the Iroquois. But I think the cycle that Richter described is pretty clear, right? As Europeans arrive and disease starts to take lives. So that requires mourning wars. To fight those wars effectively, there's sort of an arms race, right? You require muskets that are being acquired through the fur trade. Those muskets make the warfare more lethal than it had been before, right? It resulted in death that hadn't occurred in that way before. To acquire those muskets required people to travel farther and farther afield in search of the beaver pelts they needed, right? And that brought them into conflict with other people. So you're going out there to try to incorporate outsiders, take captives, and the whole premise of the operation is to avoid taking casualties. But as changes, the availability of weapons and the need to travel farther and farther to find the fur pelts to do that, right? The Mohawks are up on the St. Lawrence, or Haudenosaunee people in general are up, raiding fur trading peoples who are making their way to Quebec, right? In Montreal and Quebec, hitting them on Lake Ontario or on the St. Lawrence River and even farther north, and essentially taking their pelts and turning those pelts into manufactured goods. So the Beaver Wars, it's a misleading title, right? It's a bunch of things converging going on here. And the Wendots were sort of the next target after Haudenosaunee people had been attacking other groups in, what is today New York, and then moving outward in this need to take captives to bring people into the Longhouse, the Iroquois Longhouse, to take the place of those who died. And the Wendots were essentially conquered by the Haudenosaunee by, I think, about 1649 or thereabouts. There were Wendat survivors, don't get me wrong. And the pursuit of those survivors is a constant in Iroquois League Haudenosaunee concerns for much of the rest of the 17th century. But the main towns were destroyed. The Jesuits who were there were killed, and those missions came to an end in 1649. So you can't understand the Beaver Wars are the context going on just outside of the frame for there. And at the end, Laforgue arrives at this beautiful Wendat village, and there's the church there. The priests are two priests there. One is dead, one is dying, and he adopts. He at the end he baptizes. Father Laforgue does those Wendots who asked for baptism. They initially thought it would save them from epidemic disease. He tells them it won't, but some come in the line anyways. And just in that final frame, and I guess I didn't notice this first few, you see some Wendots in line to get baptized, but you also see a bunch walking away. They don't all, there were intense discussions within these indigenous communities over how best to understand, react to, assimilate the knowledge brought by European outsiders.
I'm wondering, Michael, do we have, we talk about the smallpox epidemic of 1634, and it is one of many epidemics that sweep through indigenous communities throughout those centuries. I'm kind of wondering, do we know of large-scale epidemics at all? Or do we know of say, is there archaeological evidence or oral histories that speak to epidemics that sweep through indigenous communities before the arrival of Europeans? Is this a thing that we know of, or is this an entirely new thing that indigenous communities are experiencing and having to conceptualize and internalize and understand and react to?
It's new, and it's stunning, and I think the way to think about it, right, is when they hit New England, 70% of a community could die in a year.
Yeah.
And I think, if you go to church or you're in a classroom, right, look around you, right, and 7 out of the 10 of the people in that room are dead in a year. What does that do to you? And I think the loss is magnified. You see this in the film, right? There's an infant dies, not smallpox, but an infant dies of a disease. And infants could die for all kinds of reasons. It's not necessarily a disease, but these diseases could be brutal on children. So the devastation of the epidemic is sort of magnified by generations, right? Because you're losing not only the population, but you're losing the population who can produce more population down the road. Mm-hmm. This was unprecedented, this scale of death. And again, the movie does this well. You see a shaman trying to heal people at the Huron or the Wendat mission, right? He's got his rattle out. He's doing what had worked in the past to harness the ritual powers to prevent bad things from happening. And obviously, those rituals from the past weren't working. And that could be attributed to the malevolence of the Jesuits, or an explanation could be that perhaps the rituals of the Jesuits are more powerful and more effective. And I really say the book I wrote on Roanoke was really premised on a lot of this. This community has these discussions and debates over sort of those two premises, right? The disease is as Thomas Harriot said, the invisible bullets fired by the English at Indians, right?
Oh wow!
Yeah, that's in his 1588 brief and true report of the Newfoundland of Virginia. That's for Roanoke colonies, right? Or that this is witchcraft, the malevolence. And again, these Jesuits could be seen as malevolent because they were so different from what any indigenous person would consider normal. right? They can't do any of the things that men could do. They're not hunters, they're not fishermen, they're not fighters, they're celibate. They practice, especially Catholic Jesuit mission, they very obviously practice their religion in a physical and visible way, whether it's the Mass with incense or the Eucharist or even reading the Bible or saying the Rosary or praying. All those things, even flagellation, are shown in the film of the very physical and visible aspects of Jesuit Christianity. So it's not a stretch to say, for an Indigenous person to say, look, the source of our problems are the actions of this individual. And you can see them doing this action right here. Watch, we're placing this baby in its grave, in a tree, and watch, he's going to go perform a spell. And he does the cross and blesses and anoints the child. It's an incantation. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion. And that's one of the things that I worry about with the movie. And is that the Jesuits thought Indigenous peoples were superstitious, crude, and backwards. In fact, in one of the last scenes, it's Laforgue and his fellow French guide, Danielle, and the woman, Chimina's daughter, who is the last, Anuka, who's the last, I think it was her name, was the last part of his party left, and he sort of parts with them. They go their own way, and he's still mocking their view of the world and that superstition. And I think that you can take the movie and you can take, just like you could take a careful reading of the Jesuit relations and say, they're no more or less superstitious than the Jesuits are, that their beliefs make no more or no less sense than the Christianity of a 17th century missionary. I think that's an important value that the film has, in addition to giving you a sense of what the world looks like, of how remote this world could be, how physically demanding this sort of work would be. You can use it, I think, carefully as a way to get at some of the complexities of what people believed, and that no one was crazy, no one was more or less superstitious than anyone else. That Indigenous peoples had a world that worked, and that world that worked is important. And I think this is a way to. I think I want to come back to the Morning War statement, because the bad guys in this movie, if there are any, are the Mohawks, right? And there's Chomina's party. They're captured. They're ambushed by a small party of Mohawks. They're kind of pinioned and dragged back to the town. They go through the rituals of torture that are described time and time again in the Jesuit relations, all part of the Morning War complex. It's the way a community dealt with the ravages of grief. And in this movie, it's just sadistic violence, right? There's no understanding of what's going on in the Mohawks, right? They're brought into the longhouse and the torture begins, right? The child is.
Did we talk about the seashell?
Yeah. Well, I think that's before the child slip, but using the mussel shell to cut off a finger. Oh, that stuff happened. It's described all the time.
Yeah.
It's described a lot. Look, man, and there's no sense of why this is going on. And look, I don't think a lot of Americans in the 21st century have a sense of how grotesquely violent European warfare was at the same time. You read about the English in Ireland, that's all you need to see. Europeans are in no position to criticize the brutality of others. That said, you get the Mohawks in this movie essentially as psychopaths and rapists who need to be escaped from. That's in a sense how the Jesuits saw them. But they're working through their own things too that make as much sense to them as, the notion that there was a Father, Son, and a Holy Spirit, and they are three and they are one, right?
Yeah, I often think about when I was, teaching in classes as a graduate student up in Minnesota, and certainly when I was teaching in high school, the big thing I was trying to talk about, especially in this particular era, we have this construct of Europeans arrive and happen to Native people. And the thing I would always try to get to my students to think about was that Native people were also happening right back, that these relationships were going both ways. I know this is a big thing with, say, exploration and things like that. My former advisor in Minnesota, David Chang, wrote this beautiful book about Hawaiian exploration and people going out and encountering the world on their own terms, right? So I feel like, you were talking about these ideas of, say, the morning wars or the ritualistic torture. these are also incorporated not because people are say brutal and and I'm using the air quotes here, brutal and savage and things like that, but because you're like you were saying, these were the operations of life that proved effective to carry on their day-to-day lives. When you encounter someone like that, you had to part of this ritualistic torture was part of their understandings of the world. You did this for reasons. This wasn't because people were necessarily evil or bad or horrible, but because these actions performed functions within their worldviews.
Yeah.
And this is how people happen right back.
Right. And this too, right? The minute you can get students, young people, whether they're in high school or college, to see that, and saying this, I realize how simplified it is, but it's not good. It's not bad. It's just different, right? Again, we can qualify that in all sorts of ways, but to get them to stop, to read the Jesuits against the grain, right? To try to understand it. There used to be this book when I was an undergraduate, this book called After the Fact. It's one of the first books I ever read in a history course. It's like one of these compilations on how to be a historian. Mm-hmm. And one of the early chapters had John Smith. It was about John Smith and Pocahontas, and showed how this was, it wasn't true. And one of the scenes they described is like, imagine someone who'd never seen a baseball game describing a baseball game, and how nonsensical a baseball game would seem to someone who'd never seen it before. And all the weird stuff that goes on the field for one thing, but then off the field and in the stands and all that. And that's, the authors made the point, that's John Smith describing the ceremonies he witnessed in these Powhatan communities. Mm-hmm. And I read that book probably when I was 18 or 19 years old, and it's always stuck with me. It's such a great, I don't even know if it's in print anymore. We don't offer a survey course at my college, so I've never had the occasion really to look for it, but it was just a great way of trying to get students to understand the lenses through which Europeans looked at the events that were happening around them. That's one area, I think, where the movie really fails in getting at what Haudenosaunee people are doing, the Mohawks in this case, and why they're doing it, right? They're just there as the heavies. Mm-hmm. And, in fact, the last slide on the thing is essentially that Father Laforgue set up the mission, baptized the Hurons, and then 15 years later, the towns were destroyed by the Mohawks. And they're not really given much fairness. And again, that's why it's a Jesuit movie, right? It's a movie about a Jesuit, and it sees the world, despite trying to make some efforts to go beyond it. It really does see the world through his eyes.
I'm kind of wondering what happens, do you think, if we tell this movie, say Black Robe, from a Mohawk perspective, how this movie changes. You're talking about these ideas. In this perspective, I'm kind of wondering if this is a story of a band of Mohawk men who encounter these invading people into their lands and treat them accordingly. Mohawks would have viewed this party as a threat?
Yeah, well, they were looking for captives. I don't think they knew that they don't know the Jesuits there, right? But they take them, and I think if I were making a movie, I think you'd jump ahead about 30 years to when the Jesuits sort of coerced the Mohawks after a military invasion in 1666. The French sort of coerced the Mohawks to accept Jesuit missionaries, and by 1666, you've got this body of knowledge, right? That Indigenous people know what the Jesuits are, and you've got living with the Mohawks. You have Wendat captives who've had more extensive experience with them, and if you made the movie from that perspective, you would have this one person, right, this Black Robe in your town doing all the stuff that 17th century Catholics do, and you would have his demonstrations of his power. Right? I mean, they had some medical knowledge, but they also had stuff that you couldn't necessarily explain how it worked. They, again, reading, writing, clocks, mirrors, telescopes, whatever, all kinds of stuff like that. And the other hand, you have these people in the community who would be watching this guy and saying he's a malevolent force, he's responsible for it. And so you would have all these people in a town watching this Jesuit priest trying to draw conclusions from his actions. And, his actions would be incomprehensible. They would be strange. They would be perverse. And you can't do anything about him because of the threat of a renewed invasion. So you've got this force you're stuck with, and focusing on the debates in the communities, they try to make sense of this person. That would be the film for me. And that, for some of the people in that town, these guys would be absolutely horrifying. For others, these Jesuits would just be weird people who can be killed and who can be resisted. And you'd have to, that was worked out community after community after community.
These were worked out, say, on independent town and family relationship levels.
Well, and I know really well Onondaga, right, where you have missionaries coming in, and they describe how at times they were roughed up, or they'd have an arrow fired at them, or they'd be threatened. At others, they'd have these people worshiping them. And here's the thing, and again, I just reread some of the stuff I'd written in this Onondaga book I'm working on. The Jesuits at Onondaga, they ministered to a church of the dead. What I mean by that is they baptized people who were at death's door, right? The idea is what you couldn't baptize people unless they understood, sort of the basics of what we'd call the catechism today, right? Sort of the basic things. But you could baptize those who were at death's door. And these Jesuits, in their writings at Onondaga, they celebrate that I've saved 30 souls for God, or I baptized 40 people and 37 of them are with God. And they celebrated this. They buried scores of children and baptized scores of dead children. It's horrifying when you think about it. They must have seemed to have, for some people, so much power. And these communities would debate. And however, those communities could be a relatively large town like Onondaga, where people are having this debate. They could be relatively tiny towns, 100 people or so, on the Carolina Outer Banks, where people are having the same discussion. And you try to make sense of these people who seem to have these powers that allow them to do strange things, allow them to have powers that ordinary people don't have. Manitou is the word in Algonquin language. Arenda is the word in one of the Iroquois languages. I'm not a language expert. That reflected this power. I mean, that's what the shaman who joins the expedition in the movie does, right? He's his face painted yellow. He's got his rattle. He's an Innu from that's what we call the Montagnais now, and he's saying that Manitou, right? He's describing them as this powerful being who's, and even that shaman is sort of trying to make sense of this Jesuit too, right? We're first introduced to him as him sort of describing the priest as a demon, and Father Laforgue just sort of dismissively, walking away from him and ignoring him. And that dynamic, I think, played itself out again and again and again. And I think it's important for people who are interested in this topic not to underestimate how malevolent the Jesuits could seem, even just as one person, in the middle of nowhere, settling in these towns. Their power was impressive.
I'm kind of wondering, you're talking a little bit about the book that you're writing now, and folks that might be interested in learning more about this particular region. Are there spitballing? I know that you and I have read more books than I can count, but are there, say, 3-5 books that you like to introduce people into, say, either an Indigenous history or the history of the region? What do you like to talk about when people say, hey, what do you do? And what should I read?
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite books in history probably have nothing to do with my field, but I think in this area, and these are books that, they're in some ways the scholarship may have moved on beyond them, but these were books that when I read them, at the point in my life when I read them, they really struck me as very powerful in terms of explaining things. And I think James Merrill's Into the American Woods, I think, is a incredibly well done book in terms of he's looking at negotiators on the Pennsylvania frontier, right? People who were go-betweens, Indigenous people and European or Anglo-Americans, and he just does this wonderful job of explaining. I mean, I think it's a very despairing book at the end, because this was headed to this story was headed in a tragic direction from the beginning. It truly was a tragic story in that it could have no other end. There were limits to how far Europeans could go in terms of appreciating indigenous culture. It's always going to end in violence, but it's just a beautiful example of what can happen when you have a really talented writer and a really talented researcher, in one person. I think it's a phenomenal book. When it came out, and I used this book for many years in my survey course, another book I liked a lot was Gregory Evan Dowd's Spirited Resistance. I think it was his first book. Probably came out when I was in graduate school, 93 or so, I would guess, something like that. But just the first chapter of that book, which was entitled Power, does such a great job of sort of setting the stage for understanding how Algonquian and Iroquois religions work in terms of understanding outsiders. And it's a simple, brilliant book that I think people can understand. You don't need a PhD to appreciate the argument it makes. I mean, it's a really fantastic book.
No, can I tell you, that was the first book I read on Indigenous history.
Yeah.
The first book. And that hooked me. As an undergrad, I was like, what is this?
Right. And I think it's a great book. Yeah. As you know, there's another book I read in graduate school. It had been out for a while. I think it came out in the late 70s. And I realize now how flawed it was. But at the time, I thought it was really mind-blowing. In fact, it was Keepers of the Game by Calvin Luther Martin, whose name says a lot, I think, about sort of his background and stuff. And, I wrote a blog post about Calvin Martin that any of the viewers of this can go track down. I don't really communicate with him much anymore. I had some problems with a later book he wrote, significant, and some other stuff he's written as well. But this notion that indigenous people could go to war against beaver and that the animals could be sentient and thinking and reasoning, to me was really eye-opening. And I think Dowd follows on that a little bit in that first chapter as well, but it really did a nice job of opening up a different way of seeing the world in terms that were, I thought, were absolutely fascinating at the time I read it. So those are three books. I mean, the most recent book I've really liked a lot. I mean, because of the textbook, I read a lot widely. The best book I've read in quite a while is a book by Justin Gage on sort of the long history of the ghost dance. We don't want the gates closed between us. And it's just really fantastic. And he's done some digital humanity stuff, talking about reaching out to different audiences. He's done some great digital humanity stuff tied into that book, just to understand how people who were involved in the ghost dance weren't just quote unquote primitives and stuff. They were writing letters to each other. They were corresponding. They were sharing news and information. And it's just it's a view of the world that really opened my eyes to sort of the late 19th century, early 20th century history of these communities and I think he does it in a way that no one else has done. So I think it's a fantastic book. He's down in your neck of the woods too. I think he's at Florida State now. So yeah, good for him.
I haven't checked that one out. I'll have to put that on there. I'll have to take a look. I just got Ned Blackhawk's book. I haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet. I'm excited about it just because I wanted to read it. It's sitting. Well, golly, sitting right next to people of the Ecotone and also citizens of the stolen land about 4 feet away from me. And literally, actually saying this, it's sitting right on top of Gregory Evans Dowd's War Under Heaven on my bookshelf right now, just from the place where it's at.
Yeah, I've ordered it. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, our big question here. Is Black Robe a history movie?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I mean, like you, I'm really interested in public history, and I think stuff I've seen in some of your tweets is that I don't, just give you indulge me here. But I was at the Shear conference in Philadelphia, and there's a panel, saying what's the matter with Florida? It was sort of the panel. It was looking at DeSantis's work and his pernicious influence on history. And as I was listening, it was really interesting papers, talks, really engaging. I had a lot of creative thoughts listening to it. But one level I've often asked, what's the matter with us historians that we aren't reaching out to the public? We write books and articles that are read by dozens of people. Really, I mean, we don't hit people. Black Robe was hardly a blockbuster, but it got out there, and it the things it does well, it does really well, and it opens the world of the Jesuit relations to an audience of people who saw it. And in that sense, yeah, it's a history. It's fiction, right? It's based on the life of a Jesuit father, but it's so close to the source material that you could have someone read a paragraph out of the Jesuit relations that mirrors what they're seeing on the screen and have a fantastic discussion. So I think it's absolutely a history movie, although I tend to be pretty liberal in terms of my definition of what's history. I'm far more far more open to how you come back to that favorite books. I think my two favorite books probably for history are in Martha Hode's The Sea Captain's Wife, or she's a character in the end at the end of the book, right? And so I love that book, but also a book, and I picked this up in an airport during a job interview.
What's that?
When I was in my interview billing, and that's a book by Norman Blaine called Young Men in Fire, which he it's a story of about, I don't know, a dozen guys or so. It's been a while since I read it, who jump in to fight a forest fire in a wildfire in Montana, and they die. They're killed by the fire. And he just not only does this really technical reconstruction of what happened and why this fire turned out to be so lethal, but he's a humanist, right? He looks at, so what lessons might be drawn from the deaths of these young guys. He's writing this as an old man who's dying of old age, and I find more historical wisdom in those books sometimes than I do in a lot of monographs, frankly. And I think that we historians can benefit by reading stuff that's not history. And there's a lot of great history that's not history. So to come back to your question about the movie, yeah, absolutely is history. It tells a story about the past. And in the sense that it's so wedded to the sources, I think it's a reasonable, it's a great interpretation of the Jesuit relations, an attempt to put the Jesuit relations on screen and make them visual, that I think is well worth anyone's attention who's interested in this period of time.
Yeah, I think at some point in time I've got to get it up on the Sunday night thing on HATM. I haven't done it yet, and I kind of feel like this might be the perfect movie that could use some curation.
Yeah.
But otherwise, people aren't going to necessarily watch this. This is not a fun movie to watch. This is not a rewatchable movie. I think you and I rewatched this film because we had this podcast. It's not a lot of fun to watch, but I think it's important for to we don't have a whole lot of films about this region or time. And like you're saying, if we write a book and 6 people read it, nothing changes.
It must have come out right around the same time as Dances with Wolves.
Yep.
And there were some movies. There was a 1492 movie that came out with Gerard Depardieu.
Conquest of Paradise, yeah.
Yeah, and there was La Otra Conquista, which was a Mexican film that's really, I think, in some ways more interesting than many of the others. But
you've got Dances in '90, and I think Dances is important because as flawed as the film is, I think it does a lot of things right, and it gets a conversation going that we really hadn't seen on this large of a scale in a very long time, maybe if ever. I think it's real easy to pick on Dances now, some 30-something years later, but it's almost like you go back and you said, "Hey, these texts now are maybe a bit dated, but at the time they were crucial to getting these conversations started." So you've got Dances that comes out in '90, and I was just talking to Lindsay Marshall about this because we did a pod on Far and Away, which is about Irish diaspora and immigration and moving out to the land rush of the 1890s, right? But you've got these kind of pseudo sweeping epics at that point in time. You've got that. You've got this film comes out in '91. Last of the Mohicans hits in '92.
Right.
So you're starting to get, at least for a short time, I think due to the success of Dances, there was a studio push to say, oh wait, let's create these other American epics, if you will. And I think this is probably in that group there somewhere. It's a different take on it.
Yeah. I was reading the IMDb notes when I was watching it. And one of the things Bruce Beresford, the director, said, he said there was no interest in it until he won an Academy Award for Driving Miss Daisy.
Sure.
And then suddenly he was a marketable director and could get something going. I think, you had to create the market, but it does fit in with these other films that are coming out at that time. Legends of the Fall and things like that. It must have been right around that time too. And it is more history than those are, for sure. And I think, Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans, you both basically, these like Black Robe are movies about white people interacting with indigenous people. Here you've got, the thing you've got really well is you've got the indigenous behaviors based on a text, and we can interpret those behaviors how we want to. We're not bound to the Jesuits. Jesuits will describe what people are doing and they'll make a conclusion. We can read that description of what they're doing and come to a different conclusion. I think that's perfectly fine.
And I think right now what we're seeing here is also a sense of, and maybe this is a thing that happens every 30 years, we're starting to see this other turn towards us, certainly with Taylor Sheridan's work, where he's talking about the West, and Wind River was the film that came out that talked to some real difficult conversations. Obviously, right now, everybody's talking Yellowstone and the whole series of that. There seems to be a whole new interest in this dynamic, but also, even more importantly, through, say, in this case, indigenous filmmakers. Did you see Prey at all, the Predator film that takes place in Comanche country?
Yeah, I watched part of it, yeah.
That Reservation Dogs, there's a bunch of stuff out there, I think, that are telling these stories that I'm looking forward to. Hopefully we'll continue to see more of them.
Yeah, right. That'd be great.
So we're talking a little earlier. Where do people find you online? Like, where do people who want to learn more about you, where do they go?
Well, I have a website, michaeloberg.com. That's where a blog is. I used to blog once a week. Now it's like, I'll get to it when I get to it.
You're writing a book.
I do that. Yeah, right. That's what I tell myself. But I try to comment on things where I feel I have some comments to make. It's like a public diary, right? Where I can, if something's bothering me, I can air it out there. I have a Twitter, Native Am Text, because I couldn't think of anything better, was my Twitter handle, and you can follow me there. I try to tweet once in a while. And then, I think Amazon.com has all the books, or your local bookstore can get all the books. I've tried to be as productive as I can. Some of those books I'm really happy with still. Not hard to find, but and if none of those things work, I'm on the SUNY Geneseo, geneseo.edu, and you click on the academics in the history department, and you can find me there.
Just enroll in a course.
You know what we're going to do? We're trying to do this, and we're trying to do something up here. I just got it started, but it's something called the 1779 Project, which is clearly derivative from 1619. But 1779 was the Sullivan Clinton campaign against the Iroquois. Burned Seneca towns, Cayuga towns. There was also sort of a New York militia campaign against the Onondagas in that year. And that's sort of the beginning of this process of dispossession in New York State. So we're trying to bring together, my colleague and I were trying to bring together some of these local historians who I talked about at the beginning of our conversation, some of the town historians, but also indigenous peoples and academics, to try to produce materials and get people thinking about the role of dispossession and the rise of New York State. There's historians who've written about that in the past, but we want to sort of further that discussion.
Wow, it's awesome. Michael Oberg, thank you so much for being here today. I cannot think. I've been wanting to do this podcast with you for the longest time, so I'm glad we were able to finally put this together, man.
Sure. It's great. I enjoyed talking to you. Take care, Jason.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to an absolute hero of mine, Michael Leroy Oberg. Thank you, Mike, for taking the time to sit down and talk to us today about Black Robe and also your amazing scholarship and all the stuff you do for your students over at SUNY Geneseo. What I wouldn't give to be able to sit down for your classes. Thank you, of course, to our intrepid producer, Fletcher Powell. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell and a host of other social media sites that I can't even begin to go. Just follow Fletcher. He's awesome. And continue listening in to Historians of the Movies podcast, and also continue to participate on Sunday nights. This week we are doing When Harry Met Sally. It's available on Amazon Prime. We'll be doing that on September 3rd at 8 p.m. Eastern. So I hope you can jump in and listen to that. And keep sharing the pod. The pod continues to grow. Keep talking about this. Keep telling your friends about it. If there are films or scholars that you want to have on the pod, please reach out and tell me so I can get those folks lined up. So thanks again, guys. You guys are amazing. I can't thank you enough for supporting the pod, for supporting me as I moved out here to Colorado. And thanks everything for being here. So with that said, ciao for now. Check it out next time.